So great. So welcome, and thank you for coming to our session today. I'll just ask a couple of questions just to get us kicked off. How many of you are in the financial services or the fintech space? Okay. How about just tech in general? All right. That's Silicon Valley. And how many of you are familiar with blockchain? Great. Okay. So we have a nice educated audience. Well, this should be a very exciting session because we actually have a panel of experts to speak with you about some of the exciting challenges and solutions that are coming about in the financial services sector. I'll just say a few words about the financial services sector. Some of you obviously are already familiar with it. But for those of you who are not, it's actually pretty large. Usually when we're here in Silicon Valley, we talk about disrupting or transforming industries. We're typically looking at sectors that are in the billions of dollars, right? If you've worked in financial services, you know that you're dealing with trillions of dollars of transactions per day, and numbers like quadrillion are not out of the question, right? You have quadrillions of dollars of transactions and payments over the course of a year. So it's a much larger space than what we're accustomed to dealing with. And the exciting thing about blockchain and distributed ledger technologies is that it has the trust of the sector, and there's actually adoption by the largest players in the industry. So we're not just talking about some small companies that are experimenting with something. This really happened in 2016, and right now, 2019, almost 2020, we have 3 or 4 years into a very significant wave of change, and we're going to be talking about that. So what I'd like the panelists to do is to introduce themselves. We'll start with Daniela, and then Erika, and then go on to Jeremy and Murat. Yep. Daniela, do you want to get us kicked off?
Sure. So I'm Daniela Barbosa. I'm the Vice President of Worldwide Alliances, and I volunteered to be an expert on this panel because many of our members in our community are building solutions for financial services, so hopefully we'll be able to share some of that. Hyperledger is part of the Linux Foundation, so for those of you that know the Linux kernel, we are really focused on building enterprise scalable blockchain solutions, or having our community build to be the next Linux, to be that every single one of you can make a decision and say, we are building using a Linux-based Hyperledger solution when it comes to distributed ledger. Today we have over 280 companies, many of them in financial services, banks like JP Morgan, BBVA, ANZ, global banks using our technology, but more importantly, building use cases for it. So we'll share some of those today.
Hi, my name is Erika Lunceford. I actually currently work for PeerNova as the head of solutions engineering, but I spent 15 years at BNY Mellon and the last few years in their innovation center here in Palo Alto. The first part of my career at BNY Mellon, I really worked in the U.S. securities clearing for like Fed securities, Fed issued securities, which clears about $3 to $7 trillion a day, and I was one of the lead business analysts in that area. So I always looked at the business impact to making business changes and what was going to happen financially and from a global perspective. And then I also ran one of our large initiatives called the Tri-Party Repo Reform Program, which was sponsored by the Fed and had participants from broker-dealers, large investors like Fidelity, Vanguard, et cetera, and many others, and so really learned a lot about change and the impact and the unintended consequences that you can have as you're rolling changes out. So when we look at blockchain and DLT technology, how's that going to impact all of us? So I'm really looking at this from tonight. I'm representing the financial services industry as a whole, and being at BNY Mellon, I had clients that went across many sectors, insurance, investment management, et cetera. So I got a purview into a lot of how things work at a macro level. And so that's what I'm here to share tonight.
My name is Jeremy Smith. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Medici Ventures, and we focus on blockchain-based startup companies. We do seed and also Series A funding. And something that I read recently was Gardner said that we've reached the trough of disillusionment in blockchain, right? And this year we have vetted over 300 companies, and we've seen all the innovation and all the things that people are trying to do and experiment with this technology. And we believe in it. And even if there is a trough of disillusionment, it doesn't mean that people are not building and people are not working, towards solutions. And we're seeing that happening. And so we'll be rising out, according to Gardner, I think, here soon. But very excited to be here, and thank you.
Hey, everyone. My name is Murat Akdeniz, and I was an early Bitcoiner. And I developed a Bitcoin trading algorithm as early as 2013, I think, which got me into Cornell Tech, where I received an MBA. But I built some blockchain solutions early in the day, and I got featured in the Wall Street Journal around then, and it kind of accelerated my career into financial services because I wanted to adopt this technology. But it was still very early at the time, so I built some other use cases in large financial institutions, namely Citi and JP Morgan. And in 2017, I left to start my own wallet company. It was an Ethereum-based wallet. And later on, I found myself at PeerNova, back with my passion in adopting blockchain technology and this time enterprise use case. So I'm very excited to be in this panel of very accomplished and cool people and putting my perspective in. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'll just give a couple words. I am originally a serial entrepreneur, have been in the Valley about 20 years, and very much close to the entrepreneurial and investor community. I've raised about 75 million for my own companies and companies that I've worked with directly, and then about another 100 million plus through different programs. So I've been very involved in company building over the years. Because I like to be at the cutting edge, in the last 18 months I've been very involved with a project with my co-author, Radhika Iyengar, who you'll hear from a little bit later, which is to really look at enterprise blockchain specifically. And we're coming out with our book in a couple of weeks. Pre-orders will be available on Monday, but the book is called Enterprise Blockchain Has Arrived. And we do see that there is a spring in enterprise blockchain. So there are, if you take a look at our book, we cover about 30 different projects that are with the largest companies in the world. Our index spans a combined market cap of trillions of dollars, and there's multiple projects for all of those companies. So I think we cover probably around 250 companies, all of them household names. So this is not a space that is, again, just for some small, out-of-the-way companies. It does cover what is happening and the change that is going to be impacting the entire world. And not just in financial services, but that is one of the top 3 areas that we see will be impacted in the near term. So very excited to be here with this fintech-oriented panel and group of experts. I'd like to start with kind of a general first question, just to kind of place this in context of the financial services sector. If you've done anything in financial services, you know that there are a lot of intermediaries, and there's a lot of data, a lot of very high throughput of transactions. So my first question really has to do with, the challenges that exist with all this data and all these different intermediaries, and to look at it from the point of view of compliance and efficiency. So, your thoughts in terms of what are these challenges and who's involved?
Sure, I can start. Well, I can speak from personal experience that there's a lot of nitty-gritty details there. When you think of standard things like banks reporting to the Fed how much money they have, it should be a very simple question. But it takes a lot. It's a global effort for a bank to answer that question. When they have a meeting with the Fed and they want to say, hey, this is our liquidity coverage ratio, which is how much money we've reserved in order to absorb a shock, a financial shock if we need to, it becomes a very burdensome question to answer that, because they have to gather reports from around the world in different time zones and different data formats and kind of put that information all together and report it to a regulatory authority. And this could be an internal report as well. And when you look at different data jurisdictions that have things like GDPR or other, things that you can't, there's restrictions on that data, and there's also other items that kind of prevent you from assembling that data properly. These the effects of this kind of burden become huge, and you become unable to answer the questions that you want to answer to the people who are asking them. In a particular case, I've had a situation where we had to report how some of the assets were their positions were, but the data we were receiving was corrupted in multiple ways, where our engines that were kind of assembling that data threw a lot of the data out as an other category, to the point where it was a $50 billion worth of asset class that was categorized as other, and nobody at the company could attest to what this $50 billion was, which, as you might think, this is a pretty big amount of money, and when you need to answer the question as where that money is, the regulators expect you to answer that. So the very minor data quality issues across your organization, which might be global and around the globe, could bring up very large problems for your organization. And to clean up that data is today a manual process in financial institutions. Somebody makes a call saying, somebody from the executives make a call saying, hey, this data is not good. And then somebody has to kind of chase that data literally around the world across multiple teams to see where the source of that, the rule breakage or data breakage was, or where the data corruption happened, and go and fix it. And it's a multiple day process. Guess what? Your meeting with the Fed already went bad. So when we think of these data issues, which a lot of us are in the technical world, and we think it's just a technical problem, it affects the real world really badly, and it's fixed through the adoption of various technologies, which blockchain is one of, is very important. And again, like a lot of financial institutions want to adopt AI, but you can't train great models on corrupted or inaccurate data. So you need to be able to attest to the truth of that data before you're able to kind of take that step and say, hey, I'm a multinational bank with 200,000 employees, and now we're ready for adopting AI. So a lot of those data issues become kind of hindrances on your progress as an organization and your ability to attest to what's going on in your organizations, and especially if you're a Fortune 50 company, this affects you and the globe in a macro level.
Great, thanks. Jeremy?
Sure. I think we're living in a state of declining trust, and that's looking at a macro level. But even within organizations, there can be a lack of trust within a large organization. So I was having a conversation this year with a department head within a large organization, and we were talking about data. And they said, well, I trust my data, but I don't trust the data in the other entity that has the same data. It's the same data, but I don't trust that other department and that other business unit within the same organization. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, because I trust my processes, I trust my people, but I don't know what they're doing over there. And so whenever I get their data, I have to run it through processes. I'm not sure if I can trust it or not, but I trust my data. Well, I went over to the other department and asked them. And they said the exact same thing about the other side. So what was the real problem there? There was a lack of trust, right? And so where I see, distributed ledger technology really helping out is that it can start to bridge some of these trust issues that can exist within an organization. That's what gets me excited, because think about all the time and effort and money spent in trying to establish trust even within your own organization. It's a big problem.
Erika?
Yeah, so, coming from a large organization that actually built up over time, and many organizations are like this. If you look back at the 90s, the number of mergers and acquisitions that were going on, it was constant. And by the time you got into the early 2000s, you ended up with some very large institutions that had absorbed all these other institutions. While they had gone through this process, though, they picked up all the technology as they went along. And because you look at financial services, they were one of the earliest to be automated. So you're going back to the 50s or 60s. With that automation that occurred then, you have the most technology debt out of almost any other industry, because other industries, especially a new one, can jump straight to the new technology, just to give you an extreme example. When you have these technologies that are really separated, they all give data in very different formats. Lots of times, if you look at a traditional mainframe or COBOL type system, you'll see instances where they redefine the same record a million different times because they're trying to squeeze data into it. And they don't want to make any system changes, so they reuse fillers, they reuse other things to put the data in. So there's a lot of mess inside of that data. And so it takes a lot of people to bring all that data together. And so every time you have a new regulatory item that goes on, people have to go back to all those source systems and get that data. And so they go back to the source system, they spend weeks analyzing that data, bringing that data into a common place. Somebody's defined the perfect data model for that particular regulatory item, and they all feed their data into that. So if you look at that, each of those systems, with the people who have to do that, if you look at the direct expense, you've got the business analyst who's spending full time on it. You've got at least 2 developers on the output side and 1 developer on the input side for each of those feeds that's going on, and that's anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks for those 4 individuals. And we haven't even counted the time that it takes for other people, subject matter experts, to answer questions about that data and make sure that how you're specifying the data is the correct way to specify that data. So with that, it takes a lot of effort to put together a compliance or a regulatory view for your organization. And because of the way specifications are kept today, it's also a very repetitive task bringing together a common view that goes across that. And so you continuously keep going back to those same poor people are constantly extracting their data and putting it into a different format for someone, or the same people are answering the same question that they answered 3 months ago about the data. And so that's a real problem because we have this spread all over the place. And then over time, that also has gotten a little bit exacerbated because of efficiencies that a large organization tries to put in place. So if you look at a startup is trying to get scale, right? A large organization has achieved scale, but then they're not as nimble at that point. And when they've achieved scale at that point, they've optimized their operation in such a way that you have one individual who knows one task, came in the door 20 years ago and started to do that task, doesn't have the context of how that task hooks to other tasks, which also affects the compliance and regulatory output. So that's really the situation that we're in today with any organization that has had a lot of changes over the last few decades.
Great. Daniela?
So I think the most promising is the types of companies that are coming in to deliver solutions around blockchain solutions, right? Because ultimately, you cannot drop a black box of blockchain and say, hey, I'm blockchain enabled, welcome. There are, the data issues, the standardizations, the regulatory requirements, the business processes, the budget owners, like where do these things sit? So I think it's really important to understand that we're actually we're in very early stages specific to blockchain, and a lot of the issues that, for example, Erika mentioned are not blockchain issues. They're issues about the fact that the world is changing specifically to how these big organizations and financial services and banks basically touch everything in our lives, from healthcare to insurance to education to everything. These are central points of us. So the other thing that's really important is to think about identity. right? And how identity really ties into this, and identity in two ways. Identity as a person who in the past, maybe 50 years ago, my only interaction with the bank was walking down the street to the central bank, to the bank that was there, and going to my safe deposit box, checking my physical paper, and imagine how different that is today and what power I as an individual have around all my financial interactions with banks today. So I think, two things that we should consider. One is that this stuff is relatively new and there's a lot of services and technology that needs to be built around it. Number two is that regulation is still outstanding. There's still a lot of questions around regulation. And number three is we have to, in order to really attain the trust that blockchain technologies are supposed to deliver to us, we need to figure out identity and digital identity and self-sovereign identity.
Great. Well, those were some very complete and comprehensive and deep points about, the data issues that we have, not just in financial services, as Daniela pointed out, but really across the board. And if you really look at it, it really has to do with centralization. When you have centralization, if you look at what Jeremy was talking about, Jeremy was indicating that every organization trusts its own data, but it doesn't trust other people's data. And so as a result, you get this whole issue of what is called reconciliation, right? So these different groups have to reconcile the different data and information. And this is what Erika and Murat were also talking about, because they have to answer, why are your values different from the other people's values who were also involved in the same transaction. And because we're dealing with money, money is really important to people. And if you have maybe 30% less money than you had yesterday, you're not going to be very happy. And if somebody else gets 50% more that they weren't supposed to get, they're going to be really happy. But that means there's a lot of other people that have lost money, right? So we have to get this right. And so data integrity is really critical, specifically in financial services, because we're dealing with something that's so important to all of our existence. So we have issues of trust, we have issues of compliance, we have issues of efficiency, right? A lot of people, the thing that you might want to have as an image in your mind is all these people running around trying to figure out why a bunch of numbers aren't the same in different systems. Okay? So that's kind of the picture of what goes on, and that's a multi-billion-dollar problem, right? Top analysts indicate it's about a 100 billion plus problem in terms of efficiency alone. So if we look at DLT and blockchain, and this is the next question, from the point of view of blockchain and blockchain systems, how does blockchain provide a solution, right, to this trust issue, to this efficiency issue, to this compliance issue? And are they all connected? So, Daniela?
Sure. So the first thing, it always reminds me that the old garbage in, garbage out. With blockchain, it's garbage in, garbage forever. And I didn't.
Immutable garbage.
That's Sheila Warren over at the World Economic Forum came up with that phrase, and I use it all the time. So the DLT, the smart contracts, the consensus, the actual blockchain technologies won't solve that. So and to your point, it's a bigger thing. It really is about efficiency. So we had a discussion around what use cases. So I did some research in our community around use cases that we have, and a lot of the use cases are really about speed to market. Reconciliation, making sure that payments are done faster, and a lot of the experimentation is done on that. So, one example that I thought would be, helpful to provide to this audience is in Australia, and also one that you don't hear all the time because it's not U.S. based. In Australia, ANZ or ANZ, as they like to call themselves, ANZ Bank, Westpac, and a consortium of 15,000 retailers, so real estate agencies that rent out mall spaces, basically, in Australia and New Zealand. And they created a consortium, basically a network, a blockchain network, in order to be able to do verification of people who wanted to take out a loan through ANZ Bank and Westbank, and to take out a loan in order to rent a store. Right, so they had to put in capital in order to get a lease so that they could open up their business. So they created this network, and it's going into production, I think, later this year, in order to create efficiencies in that process, because the amount of paper, the digital paper processing requirements and the time from initiation to end was a process that was taking too long. And they've actually reduced it to a number of days versus weeks of that process. And this is a small consortium, 2 banks, I think it's 3 retailers working on it, but they've proven out that the efficiencies, and it's not like, and they're not screaming blockchain, 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 they're screaming out, hey, we just reduced a process that took, X amount of weeks to 2 days. And what that means is that the retailers can get people into the stores faster. The people who want to start a business or open up a business can start that faster. And the economy as a whole, the people who are suppliers to that business, the employees who now can get to work faster, it changes the microeconomic benefits of what the banks were doing. And those are the kind of use cases that are not sexy, they're not changing the world, but you know what? It gets 15,000 stores potentially open much faster, and people employed and people buying product.
Sure. So definitely on the efficiency side, that's a check.
Yeah, so I'm going to give kind of 2 examples. One was an example that BNY Mellon actually published in the news, and it was related to the U.S. Treasury clearance business. And basically, the problem statement was that you have $3 to $7 trillion going through the system. BNY Mellon now has 100% of that market that's been awarded to them, and so the Fed wanted to make sure that, if anything went wrong with those systems, that they would still be able to operate. So one of the things that they actually did was build a blockchain solution that was a parallel solution to the actual systems, use a totally different technology stack. And so it basically provided business continuity for them. By having this parallel thing that went along the side. It actually had another benefit as well, which was fraud protection, because it was keeping a parallel ledger, and anytime if somebody were to tamper with the real system, you would see the 2 balances running next to each other and can tell that something had gone wrong. So that's one example of implementing blockchain. I think some of that was a very internally facing solution, and when you look at that, it's still not quite giving clients visibility into that or being able to share that data. So it has some of the attributes of blockchain, but not all of them. Another use case was really being able to track a financial transaction as it goes through the organization. So to clear a transaction or to move it along, it touches anywhere from 6 to 12 systems every time you're processing a transaction. And so being able to stitch together that view so that people can see where a transaction is and prioritize, if something's getting stuck, what do they need to do? Is there something wrong with that system? Is there something wrong with the operations? Is there something wrong with the transaction? And so being able to highlight those types of things to operations on a real-time basis is extremely valuable, because usually if something goes wrong, you're running around like crazy trying to figure out how to fix that. And so that was another example that I saw, and I'm seeing more as I work for PeerNova now in that reconciliation space and other areas.
And one of the examples I'm going to use, they're actually not using blockchain, but blockchain would be a very good use case in this. And what I'm referring to is the country of Estonia. I know a lot of people here like X-Rose, is it blockchain, is it not? So we brought over the guys who actually built it over to Medici Ventures for a few days to actually understand how does it work. And what it gave me was a glimpse. So imagine a world, if you move, you have to change your address all over the place. Your utility company, the post office, all your bills, it's a major pain, right? Well, there with their system, if you need to change your address, you log in, you change your address, now everyone knows what your address is. You change it one time. Now, they're not using blockchain. Some people think they are, but they're not. Because, well, one, the technology didn't exist when they started building it, but also because their government, quite frankly, doesn't value privacy. Now, something here, we believe in privacy. We believe that you have a right to your own data, to a right to your identity. There, they don't quite do that, so everything is very open. But what it gave, though, was a glimpse of a future to me, of a system where you have interoperability between government entities, departments, also with private companies, and then it creates a better user experience for me as a citizen as well. Because now I don't have to go all over the place to try to change my address, as that example I gave. Now I can go to one place. And so I think it's important because, again, they're not using blockchain quite yet, or maybe they won't, but I saw what's something that we can do here, something that we can do in the governments around here, or at least within companies and enterprises as well, because it creates efficiencies, but it also creates a better user experience as well, which is something I think that we need to also keep in mind when we're addressing a lot of these issues.
I'll be brief. I'll give two brief examples. Number one is trust in the setting of transacting with somebody on the internet. And when you think of transacting with somebody, that's probably the transaction that lacks the most amount of trust. Like, they're a stranger on the internet. And the fact that Bitcoin covered that case, I think, attests to the value of what blockchain can do, because we can both look at some public ledger and agree that, yes, what's on this public ledger is true, and we don't have to trust each other in order to be able to do that. And I think that's fairly simple. But the more complex one is if I'm a network operator and I operate a node on the blockchain network, and I ran my node maybe in 2010, and I thought this was awesome technology, and then my friends and family said, this is some nerd stuff that we don't understand. And then 5 years later, I found out that it's a big thing again. I want to plug into the same network and continue what I wanted to do. Well, how do I know it's the same network? How do I trust this network? How do I know if my money's still on this network? How do I attest to that? And the fact that I'm able to do that, I'm able to plug in and out of the network whenever I want and continue to what the majority of the network has agreed as to what the state of the network is, I think that's a very powerful element of trust that exists in probably only in blockchain, because if you connected to a database 5 years later, you would have to kind of trust that database admin to say, hey, this is the same database and whatnot. You wouldn't have any other method to do that. So I think that's very powerful.
Great. So, we've seen some different examples, so thank you for sharing, all those different examples with us. What you probably heard was there's a range of things. So in one sense, Daniela was speaking about digitization. So there's a lot of processes today that they're just paper-based, right? And so if you bring in a DLT or a blockchain-based system, you can digitize everything, right? From the time it's implemented, it all becomes digital, it all becomes trusted in terms of that digital basis. A lot of times people use paper because they don't trust things that are, digital, but now you have a foundation of trust. So that's one way, and that's some early wins, are being done that way. If we look at other examples around reconciliation, right, and around just efficiency, which the other panelists did talk about, you're really looking at this shared ledger. So rather than wondering what does somebody else have on their ledger because you can't see it, well, we can all look at it, right? If you're within a permission network, for example, in the financial services sector, everybody in that network can look over as long as they have rights and ensure that my value and your value are the same, right? And so there isn't any reconciliation, and that saves a lot of time because reconciliation takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of billions of dollars every year. So we have this shared ledger, we have trust that's coming from consensus, and we have digitization. So those are some, easy use cases where we can see how blockchain can provide real value. The next question I have is maybe to go a little bit deeper. Daniela actually touched on this in terms of saying, okay, we're going from weeks down to days, and that makes a difference if you're a small business, right? If you get something done in days versus weeks. And so you're looking at an 80 or 90% reduction in time, which equates to money faster, right, for that business. But in terms of the efficiencies that people are seeing, what type of cost and time savings are you seeing from blockchain systems?
I'll give another example, which wasn't on my list, but your comment made me think about it. Actually, the government of British Columbia just launched a project called Orgbook, and they use Hyperledger Indy. And it's identity from an entity perspective from a company. And I think they have over 7 million companies now on the org book. And what the org book is essentially your use case, is that I, as a business owner, if I go and I'm opening a business and I need to go get a liquor license, or I need to go renew my liquor license, or maybe, you know, the owner has changed in that business, it could take me weeks and a lot of my personal time to go from agency to government agency to government agency to say, hey, you know what, this is the new owner of the liquor license, well, this is the new owner of this, and on and on. And they have created a government-based network that now, you know, I think there's 5 million different entities in it and multiple agencies on that. And once again, it is not only a time saving, but also a trust, right? Because if I'm about to issue this gentleman here a liquor license, because he looks like he needs one, you can, you know, trust me that I issued that to him. So now you can go sell liquor to him, or, you know, and you can go and have a drink there. So it's really about trust and efficiency, and we're seeing a lot of those use cases. That's a public use case that you can look up on our website. To do that. The other thing is there's an example of this bank in Belgium, and they're working, I think, with close to 80 different cities in Belgium, and they've built a very cute, I call it cute because it's a very cute use case, which is making people actually get coins, or kids get coins for riding their bikes to schools in different places that have RFIDs things on their helmets. But what they're learning is they have all these banks and these cities are now learning about DLT. And it's not like the ultimate use case, but you have technologies that now you have people internally at these banks going, hey, I know why blockchain, I know why smart contracts are needed, I know why consensus. So we're starting to see a lot of that.
Okay, great. I was just flagged that, thank you, Daniela, that we only have a couple minutes to go. So rather than, go into just continuing this question, why don't we just ask a quick question to the panel? And I'm sorry that we don't have time for questions from the audience, but, we'll be here afterward. So maybe starting with Murat and coming this direction is, in terms of what the impact will be from blockchain and DLT in the next 3 to 5 years, is it going to be a change that is kind of on the periphery and is just, with a few different application points, or is this going to be something that's going to be truly transformative? And so, for everyone to comment on.
I've previously given speeches at a couple of universities about how transformative it will be, so I'm going to go with that. The main driving factor is that social change in our era is driven by technology. And even when you look at current events today, such as protests going around in the world, technology is like at the top priority of it. Tech companies are involved in it even if they don't want to be, and technology is used as a tool throughout that entire process that affects people's daily lives.
Great. So the answer is yes, it's transformative, it's big. Jeremy?
I would say definitely yes. I think from my perspective, one of the biggest things that will touch all of our lives, we've touched on it tonight, is identity. I think that is going to be something that is an easy use case that everyone can understand, because right now your data is valuable. I think I read this year that data has surpassed the market cap of oil globally. And when your personal data is out there, what happens is it actually has value, because if I take your personal data, I could then use it to maybe steal your identity, right? Take out credit cards and do whatnot, do fraudulent activity. Well, the idea around blockchain and DLT and what it can do with identity is to drive the value of that personal data down to zero. So that if someone has your personal data, it doesn't mean they can do anything with it. They can have your address, they can have your social security number, they can have your name. It does not matter, because they cannot transact in a digital world with your identity.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy.
You're welcome.
And so the answer is yes, plus identity. Erika?
Yeah, I do believe that this technology is going to transform things, and from a business point of view, I think it's going to make things quiet. And what I mean by that is, if you go onto a floor of almost any operation or something like that, you hear people yelling back and forth on the phone, sending emails, working really long hours trying to get their jobs done. And I think that this technology really has the possibility of making things quiet and peaceful from trying to get your work done.
Okay, so yes, and it's going to be a quiet future.
Two things really quickly. One, data is the new oil, and nobody wants an oil spill on there. That's why distributed ledgers are important. And number two, and I wrote this down because I think it's really important to think about the changes of how financial services are going to have to be accountable to society. So last month, 130 Tier 1 and Tier 2 banks signed a responsible banking principle with the UN. And basically, this is committing them to strategically support the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I really think that businesses without the trust and transparency of blockchain services, of platforms, will not be able to do it.
And so the answer is yes, plus societal change. And I just wrote a book about how transformative it is, and so feel free to take a look at it. It's called Enterprise Blockchain Has Arrived. I've written it with my co-author, Erika. She'll be speaking a little bit more about it. And with that, thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed the panel.